So we had talked about outdoor air pollution. We've talked about sources of that, but one of the largest killers is indoor air pollution. So I've got this graph here. These are some of the top killers that every year. And you can see, of course, high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes is up there, alcohol use. But number 1, 2, 3, 4 is air pollution, outdoor and indoor. And number 5, 6 is outdoor air pollution. These are issues. And so we need to make sure we understand the impacts of both outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. Okay, so if we're talking about how dangerous indoor pollution is, it depends on the type of substance involved, but most importantly, it depends on the duration of exposure. Most cases are short-term exposures, and maybe you breathed a bunch of cigarette smoke all of a sudden, or you opened up a can of paint thinner and you inhaled too much. They're short-term, and those are what we call acute. Those can cause sore throats, shortness of breath, a little bit of fatigue, headache, but they're not going to create long-term effects. Long-term exposure, however, this is dangerous. This leads to pulmonary disease, autoimmune disease, neurological disorders, and cancer. We spend most of our time indoors, and it's that repeated exposure every single day for years and years and years. That's what causes the issues. Now, one thing I love about apes is that it is more of a social science, and this is a great example. This graph here, this is showing the share of deaths from indoor air pollution in 2017. And you can see that, unfortunately, this dramatically affects low-income people and people who live in poverty. So you can see it in Africa, you can see it in Southeast Asia, even up in North Korea, and as well over in Latin America. Countries that are poorer don't have the access to the new technology. They're burning biomass. They don't have the money to spend on airflow throughout their house. And therefore, they have a lot more exposure, more importantly, that long-term exposure, than the rest of the more affluent world. Okay, so these are all of our main sources of pollution. Asbestos, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, pesticides, radon, mold and dust, VOCs, and lead. And all of these are categories of indoor pollution. However, we're going to categorize them a little bit more based on their sources. So these indoor air pollutants can be natural sources. That means that they're made naturally, things like radon, mold, and dust. They can be man-made, so VOCs, formaldehydes, asbestos, lead, pesticides. And then we have our combustion products, which are carbon monoxide, tobacco smoke. Tobacco smoke we have not talked about yet. It's not as big a deal when it's an outdoor pollutant, but it is a massive issue as an indoor pollutant. And then the other ones you've seen before. All right, let's talk about radon. Radon is a colorless, odorless, radioactive gas that is naturally produced from uranium and igneous rocks. So where we often see this is the rocks kind of break apart and it leaks up from the rocks. This is a bigger issue in homes that have basements or in some parts of the country. It kind of depends on what the rocks are and the bedrock. If we have more igneous rocks, then we're going to have a lot more radon. Long-term exposure to radon causes a form of lung cancer that is so different than cigarette smoke. It's very interesting. If you have lung cancer from this and you go see a doctor, there are very clear signals that make this lung cancer a sign that you had radon poisoning compared to cigarette smoke. And this is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the US. As I mentioned, it's much more dense than air, so it accumulates in these basements and these first floor living spaces. A lot of people have radon detection, so they can actually determine to see where it is, or they have prevention mechanisms that will deviate the radon around the foundation. But the bigger issue is when it gets into groundwater. And this exposure happens when we shower with the groundwater or when we drink it. So areas that have wells, for example, which is very much in this area here, there's a lot of wells. And so they are sourcing their own water. It's not being purified and managed by a city. Instead, they're just tapping into a well and they're getting it very naturally. But unfortunately, that water has a lot of radon in it. And so anytime they shower with it, they're inhaling fumes. And anytime they drink it, of course, is coming into their body. I feel like people freak out about mold. Mold is not as dangerous as we always think it is. I think there's been time periods where people have been scared of mold. It's really not that bad compared to other things. So as a lot of you know, molds tend to grow on wet surfaces inside our homes, damp wood, window frames, anywhere where there's a lot of condensation. And then that mold is going to release the spores, and it's those spores. Those spores are the ones that cause the stuffy nose, the wheezing, the itching, the itchy eyes, and especially people who are prone to allergies. Sometimes there is a link between mold and asthma, but there is no evidence of that it causes worse health effects. All right, formaldehyde. You may be familiar with this because you dissected something in biology, and all the time that smells like formaldehyde. It is a very strong smelling substance, and it's present in glues. And recently they're using a lot more of these glues to make furniture, IKEA furniture, where they're pressing these woods together. So in the last 20 years, most furniture makers have gone away from traditional methods, and they're going with these cheaper methods, which unfortunately mean they're using formaldehyde. This is also present when we put in new carpets, new upholstery. And if you're constantly working with that, then you can have long-term issues. It can also be found in cigarette smoke. And this formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. Carcinogen means it is cancer causing. So over time, enough exposure will lead to cancer. All right, then we have pesticides. You've probably heard of what a pesticide before. These are designed to kill insects, bacteria, mold, rodents. The issue is that we use them and then we store them in our house. And then the plastic around the seal kind of gets loose. They spill, and that is when those fumes are released and we inhale them over and over again, especially if they're stored in like a cabinet. And every time, if you open up that cabinet every single day, you're going to get a lot of exposure. Our symptoms are going to be weakness, muscle twitching, nausea, tingling, but long term, it's a big issue. This will cause damage to kidneys and then eventually the central nervous system. At the end of the day, if there's a bottle of pesticide and you smell things out of it, it's time to recycle it. You need to get rid of that, and then when you need to use it again, you will just buy another one. All right. VOCs. We've talked about VOCs before. You know what these are. The last two things we talked about, the formaldehyde and the pesticides, those are also VOCs, but they are liquids that produce a smell. Fuels, glues, paints, paint removers, and a lot of times you've experienced it just by being around them. It causes headache, maybe nausea. Longer term, though, damage to kidneys, liver, and the central nervous system, and cancer. That was all covered up here. Oops, sorry. And then we have asbestos. Asbestos is a fibrous mineral, and they discovered it because it's extremely strong as a heat resistant. The issue, though, is that it has these tiny little fibers, these sharp silica-like fibers, and then when those get into the lungs, it causes a lot of damage in the lungs. And so it's important that whenever we're dealing with asbestos, that we are protecting ourselves. This is a lot in cars and in homes. We see it in brakes, we see it in clutches, we see it in roofing, cement, artificial tiles, because it is so strong. And so a lot of time it has to be dealt with, and that exposure can be reduced by removing that asbestos-containing material from the home. But this needs to be done by a professional because there's so many little fibers that can be kicked up in that process, which would increase your exposure levels. So we have to use professionals to remove asbestos. And then lead. Lead we talked about with the leaded gas and the impact it had on preschool children, but that was in the air outside. Now let's talk about inside. It is a heavy metal. There should be no lead ever present because any presence of it is very dangerous, and it causes significant health problems. Developmental delays in children, neurological problems, anemia, kidney damage, brain damage, death. But the main source are old paint and old pipes. Old paint, old pipes. And here's another example of when the people who are living in these homes with old paint and with old pipes are unfortunately low income most of the time. And so they're renting. The landlord has no desire to put all this money in to fix the pipes and to scrape off all this paint. And so they are unfortunately become the victim of this lead in the drinking water and of paint chips. If you go off to university, a lot of times universities will make you sign a waiver that you won't eat the paint chips. And this is why. One sad story that I want to talk about, and again, this unfortunately relates to socioeconomic status. But in 2014, there was the water supply for the city of Flint, Michigan was contaminated. And unfortunately, rather than purchasing water from a safe source, they began using the water from the Flint River. Well, what they didn't know is that the water in the Flint River had a high concentration of chloride. And the chloride, when it runs through those old lead pipes, leaches that lead out of the pipes. And all of a sudden now I have lead ions in my drinking water, which, as we know, causes extreme damage, neurological damage. And again, this community is a poor community. So they had to really speak up and receive a lot of help to fight this battle because they were the impoverished group who had lost their jobs and were suffering. But I want to remind you that this is the only indoor pollutant that can kill fast. So fast. It is a colorless, odorless gas that is produced by incomplete combustion. We've talked about that. And that's normally coming from gas stoves or heaters. This carbon monoxide is an asphyxiant, and it binds to that hemoglobin in our blood, so therefore oxygen can no longer be delivered to our cells. So if you're ever in a situation where you're in a basement, you can't smell this, unfortunately. So look for symptoms: dizziness, confusion, shortness of breath, seizures, and then unfortunately, this can lead to death. This is why we have detectors. Very important. I think I've mentioned to everybody that when you move into your first apartment, you need to make sure that you have a carbon monoxide detector. And so that will help mitigate it, but also having your gas appliances inspected, very important. We've already talked about NOx and SO2 and PM 2.5s, but these can all be produced by any appliances that burn methane, propane, or kerosene. I feel like there's a few of these left. You don't see many of them anymore, but I just wanted to pop that in there. And then let's talk about indoor particle material. This is our PM 2.5s and our PM 10s. These are produced by stoves, by candles, by cooking, by smoking. And this long-term exposure really aggravates the coronary system and the lungs, leading to heart disease and lung disease, and also, unfortunately, premature death, and especially with people with these conditions. However, we are lucky enough that, again, we are using propane and we're using fuel and we're electricity, but developing countries aren't as lucky as we are. They don't have that infrastructure put into place. So they have to use biomass fuels, wood, animal droppings, and that produces so much particle matter. So they're filling their homes with all these PM 2.5s and the PM 10s. And so therefore, around 3 billion people who are using those fuels, we're seeing 4 million deaths annually. That's greater than COVID ever was. So this is a big issue and one of the reasons why these indoor air pollutants are causing great deaths. All right, the last one I want to talk about is tobacco smoke. As I mentioned, we haven't talked about this yet because it's not a big deal outside. Inside, it is a massive issue. We already know that tobacco is full of carcinogens and it can lead to cancer and death. However, it's the secondhand smoke, that smoke inhaled by the non-smokers, that has a lot of carcinogens in it as well. And unfortunately, those carcinogens lead to heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, and sudden infant death syndrome, where infants will just die in their sleep, unfortunately, and asthma. And so unfortunately, this is exposed to a lot of children. A lot of children grow up in homes that are full of tobacco smoke and are just inhaling it all the time, and therefore later in life are exposed to these issues. Okay, best way to avoid health complications from indoor pollution: detection by monitors, carbon monoxide, radon monitors, ventilation. It costs money, but heat your home, buy air purifiers. Maintenance, again, costs money, but get people to check your pipes, get people to check your stoves, check your heaters, make sure we don't have any incomplete combustion going on or lead in our pipes. And then education. If we had no idea that pesticides were VOCs, or if we had no idea that tobacco smoke was a carcinogenic, then we can't do anything about it. So all 4 of those are very important. All right, that was a long one, but thanks, guys.